let's see hands and to whom the questions are directed. And I think I saw Ted's already.
I wanted to ask Bob, so somebody else first.
Questions? Yeah. In back? Yeah, go ahead.
Jerry, I thought I heard you say something about underlying space-time with bubble.
Yes, there is, in the multiverse picture, there is the underlying space-time that it would be like normal space-time within a universe itself, except it is expanding even faster than an individual bubbleverse. It's more unstable. And so the regions of space would basically be defined primarily by their cosmological constant, and this would have one of the largest cosmological constants. So it's expanding even greater than, at a higher rate than the bubbleverses themselves. And this is one reason why bubbleverses really don't come in contact with each other, because this is, imagine you have these bubbles in your soda, but someone's also, imagine it pouring more soda in, so that there's always soda between the bubbles and they never really hit. Yes?
What's the latest empirical evidence that such multiverses exist? I mean, there's a lot of theoretical discussion, but in terms of actual observations and astrophysics, my understanding is that there's not a lot that we know. There was recently an indication in the cosmic wave background of some waves that may be related. But I'm just wondering what there is.
There's something called B-mode polarization, and this is basically saying that you look at light, and polarization is the directions that the electric fields themselves have for a photon. The stronger this effect is in the CMB, basically the faster the production rate of bubbles would be. But if we can find B modes at all, then that does strongly imply that you can't have just one universe inflating. Unfortunately, it was there could be two causes: the underlying effect in the CMB, and also the effect that the CMB traveling through gas in a galaxy can occur. And now it's basically determined that at least a good share of the effect was due to gas interference. So you're right. But the Planck, which is independent observation, is now working with the South Pole Observatory to release combined data. So we will know within the next few months about what the contribution was to that. And so I'm waiting for that. I'm very anxious to see. This is where, as I was saying, and I don't want to take too much time on this one question, but it's an issue where inherently science is at a point where we are making predictions that are not strongly testable. Faith is becoming an element of science too. And this is what bothers some scientists. They don't want us going past the path, but it's almost inevitable that we do.
Paolo, you had your hand.
Question for Gerald Cleaver.
Yes.
You have spoken about inflation and the multiverse. Could we understand that also regarding time? That is, that inflation comes from a deflation. And instead of putting one Big Bang for all the world of universes, could be several Big Bangs.
Yes.
So in a way, the T0 you said is not equal eternity, but T0 is the endpoint of a previous setting of time.
Yes, there are cyclical versions of this that predict the time scale is a bit different. It's about every 100 trillion years there's a new cycle of these things occurring. A new cycle, yes, and we predict basically there's about 10 to the 500 bubbles in Big Bangs at a time. Yep.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
My question is for Dr. Russell concerning theodicy. Darwin's famous wasp creates a real conundrum for intelligent design. I mean, the wasp that lays its eggs in the caterpillar eats it from the inside out very, very slowly, so it doesn't kill it quickly and results in part of Darwin's loss of faith. Intelligent design kind of breaks down there. Was that intelligently designed? So my question for quantum indeterminacy and Neota is, how do you see that link?
Thank you. I think theodicy is one of the hardest problems monotheists have. And it certainly isn't generated by Neota. It's there, right? The question is whether Neota exacerbates it or begins to move it, ameliorate it. Arthur Peacock would have said it exacerbates it. And so he would push God much back to the sort of beginning conditions. My response to Arthur was, well, that's a way to handle it, but you still have the problem. So I'd rather have God in the process acting, and rather than having God sort of setting up the conditions at the beginning and letting them unfold. Now, does that mean to identify God as the only actor in processes like mutations? No, of course not. Nature is acting as well. So it's a complex view of agency. Second, even in the basic biblical tradition of, say, Joseph sold into slavery, right? And then his family coming. He would say in the same event that you did for evil, God did for good. So there's a kind of double agency or evaluation of what's actually happening. Another one is to say, from my Lutheran colleagues like Ted, that where it seems to be that God's involved in radical suffering, like the cross, you actually see an example of God's power to transform. So somehow those kind of fragments of insights about the problem of evil have to come together and be applied to evolution. And that's a hard problem. And I've written about it, I've talked about it for a long time. Remember, the Neota applied to evolution is an application of a previous idea that Neota is a way of thinking about God acting at all in the world without intervention. So it does apply to evolution, but it also generates problems. Whether or not you view evolution through Neota, you still have suffering in nature. You still have the wasp we talked about. So unless you or I were to say God has no control over it or no response to it, is not responsible for it, which I don't think would help, somehow we've got to work on that question.
Well, if you go back and just link it to that there's this impulse for complexity, and complexity results in certain things like the wasp.
Right.
But that God is not the agency directly for that wasp. In other words, the sort of order to creation is emerging complexity.
Right.
And with that emerging complexity will be all kinds of things like the wasp and the ability of the chemicals.
I agree. I guess what I'm saying is there's sort of two avenues. Either try to find ways to exonerate God's responsibility for the actual fact of suffering, and that's one way. Arthur's was another way. Or, and process theology is the third way. John Polkinghorst is a fourth way. Or say our best hope is God's involved in that suffering, but involved in redeeming it. And that's the way of the cross. So what we see, like with mutation that produces the wasp, is like the cross. We see explicit suffering. This guy is brutally executed, right? No angels floating around. He's just executed. And yet, you and I as Christians would want to say, somehow in that is the secret of God's power. It's the power of suffering love. So I want to take that part of the argument and then look at evolution through that lens. I've got God involved, right? That's what you said, and you're right. But God's involvement produces redemption. Okay. So I'm just saying in a little more detail what all of my colleagues say, that you take the suffering of God on the cross and apply it to nature. I'm just giving it in more detail by saying how I think divine action can be understood in more detail in that process. But it's the same sort of argument that almost everyone else calls kenosis.
It's a theory of incarnation.
Exactly. So the incarnation isn't just efficacious for humanity, although it is. It's efficacious for nature as a whole. In fact, Ted and I are producing a book in which we're talking about whether that's true for the cosmos and for all life, sentient life species, ET. So thank you. Other questions, please? Yeah, Don.
Well, I guess I'm confused about a lot of this stuff, and the whole idea between salvation and redemption assuming that there's evil in the world. And in some ways, the size of the universe and maybe multiverses and things like that really drives that into some sense of site specificity only, and not a universal. And so there's a category of maybe local evil, but I don't know about universal evil. I mean, that's a real problem. What's that about? And then what does that mean for the efficacy of the redemption and the efficacy of the Christ? You know, the whole idea of a cosmic Christ just seems to be out of proportion.
Well, I mean, just a brief comment. Obviously, redemption from moral evil is more or less strictly human, but not Nancians will say, no, you have precursors in the primate world of potential immoral behavior. But nevertheless, it's not going to apply to fraud, to all nature. But redemption from natural evil is a much broader category. Right? I mean, unless you say this predator-prey cycle is purely fine, just what it is, and has nothing to do with what God wants to change in the new creation. If you say that, then you're right. Redemption really is limited to the moral sphere with some precursors in primates. But if you say natural evil is a necessary but insufficient condition for there to be moral evil, I couldn't die if we were in thermodynamics. But thermodynamics isn't death. I couldn't be in a violent conflict if there weren't the possibility of fermion statistics, because there wouldn't be bones to crush. But fermion statistics aren't bones to crush. Unless, if you want to say natural evil is a real category, and if you want to say the purpose of creation is the new creation, and the incarnation is the means, broadly speaking, then natural evil has to be overcome, and that is cosmic. Every biological entity is a physical entity. Every physical entity follows the laws of physics, and physics includes the second law of thermodynamics.
Can't see why that's evil.
It isn't evil; it's a precursor to evil. It's part of the contingent, necessary, contingent requirements for evil in this world, and presumably it's not true in the eschaton. Okay, so it's part of what will be transformed. So it may just be a linguistic problem because I'm using the word evil two different ways. A lot of people don't like the word natural evil, but all I'm trying to say is there are precursors in the physics and biology of me and you in society which allow for the possibility of enacting real moral evil. Joshua?
Just on the last point, I was wondering if maybe Jerry could talk about entropy in the multiverse prospect. Is entropy fundamental?
Yeah, and I would say what we would, the conditions allowing natural evil in our universe likely don't exist in a large number of that 10 to the 500. This is, in fact, I was trying to think of how to phrase this. Entropy is a particular trait of our physical universe, and it's going to be a particular trait of a large number of the others, but it is not a global property.
Especially if it's contracting.
And
if
if
it's
it's contracting, it's like the
you
opposite.
might see the opposite.
But there are some that even in expansion, the physical laws can be so different from ours, and they may allow for vastly different life. Not atomic based, crystalline, gaseous. Who knows? And so their issues are totally different. I mean, imagine with some of them meeting in their conference talking about universes that might have entropy in them.
Mark, if you want to go.
Can I just comment on? So I heard Roger Penrose recently talking about the Big Bang, and he has a very different understanding of entropy in the early days. So even in our universe, the domain that you're talking about can be very different than than mainstream physics.
Yeah, early on. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. But I'm familiar with some of his work, and he's interesting to listen to.
He has that entropy went in the other direction.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, then our nice break. Is anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak so far who wants to get in? Because some of us have talked quite a bit. Yeah. Armin? Can you speak a little louder, please?
So I'm just wondering, so it seems that, is it true that for you, the closed loopness of feedback is the key to the emergent property? And is it a strong emergence or?
I think it's strong emergence because it gives you then the top-down control. And to me, strong emergence, that's the signature of strong emergence. And it's not only the closure of the feet, it's the closure of the constraints. It's not just closure of processes, because those have to remain open. These are open systems, so you're still going to have them being thermodynamically, energetically open. But it's the closure of the constraints. It's an organizational or informational closure rather than process closure.
Okay, let's thank at least 3 of the 4 speakers. 15 minutes.